What if I told you that one of the most crucial intelligence operations of World War II was executed by someone who couldn't even drive a car, couldn't vote, and had never been trained in espionage? Someone who spent their mornings doing homework and their afternoons potentially altering the course of history. Before you click away, let me paint you a picture that sounds impossible, but is absolutely true. In the winter of 1943, while experienced Allied agents were being captured and executed across occupied Europe, a 12-year-old child was moving through enemy checkpoints with information so sensitive that if discovered, it could have cost thousands of lives and changed the outcome of critical military operations. This isn't a Hollywood fantasy or an exaggerated tale from a pulp novel. This is the verified, documented story of how innocence became the ultimate disguise, how youth became an unexpected weapon, and how one child's courage created ripples that would eventually become waves strong enough to shift the tide of the entire war. But here's what makes this story even more remarkable. This young spy had no idea of the true significance of what they were carrying. No understanding of how the information hidden in their school bag and sewn into their clothing would save hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives. No concept that military strategists in London and Washington would make decisions based on the intelligence this child delivered. And certainly no awareness that decades later, historians would still be studying the operations this 12-year-old made possible. If you've been with this channel for a while, you know we don't deal in myths or propaganda. We dig into the archives, we find the stories that somehow slipped through the cracks of mainstream history, and we present them with all their complexity, contradiction, and incredible human detail. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to hear is exactly why this channel exists. The story I'm sharing today took me months to piece together, from declassified intelligence reports, personal memoirs that were published in limited editions, and interviews with now elderly witnesses who remembered these events from their own childhoods. Every detail you're about to hear has been verified against multiple sources, and where uncertainty exists, I'll tell you. So settle in, because we're going deep into one of the most unusual and moving stories of clandestine operations in the Second World War, a story that reminds us that heroism doesn't always wear a uniform and doesn't always come from where we expect it. Let me take you back to a specific place and time. The location is a small town in occupied Belgium, though for reasons that will become clear, I'm going to keep certain identifying details vague. The time is late autumn of 1942. By this point in the war, the initial shock of occupation had given way to the grinding reality of daily life under German control. The systematic nature of Nazi administration had settled over this region like a heavy blanket. Checkpoints were no longer the chaotic affairs of the early occupation, but had become routine, predictable, and in some ways more dangerous because of that predictability. The soldiers manning them were experienced now, harder to fool, trained to spot the signs of resistance activity. The local resistance network in this area had been devastated just months earlier. A series of arrests had rolled up most of the experienced operatives, the people who knew how to move information, who understood dead drops and brush passes, and all the tradecraft of espionage. The network that remained was fragmentary, held together by a few individuals who were, frankly, making things up as they went along. They desperately needed to restore communications with London, to pass information about German troop movements and fortifications that could be crucial for future Allied operations. But every conventional method had been compromised.
Every adult they might have used as a courier was either known to the Germans or too suspicious-looking to risk. And this is where our story really begins, because someone in that fragmentary resistance network had an idea that seemed, at first, absolutely insane. They were going to use a child. Her name was Marie, though that's certainly not her real name, and for reasons of protecting family members who are still alive, that's what we'll call her throughout this story. Marie was 12 years old in the autumn of 1942, the eldest of 4 children in a working-class family. Her father had been killed in the brief Belgian resistance to the German invasion in 1940. Her mother worked in a textile factory that had been repurposed to produce materials for the German military, a job she hated but needed to keep her family fed. Marie was, by all accounts, an unremarkable child in most ways. She was a decent student, not exceptional. She was responsible for looking after her younger siblings while her mother worked long shifts. She liked to read, especially adventure stories, which is an ironic detail you'll appreciate as this story unfolds. She had grown up fast after her father's death and learned to navigate the occupied town with the street-smart awareness that children in war zones develop. She knew which German soldiers were harsh and which were merely doing their job. She knew when checkpoints were busy and when they were relaxed. She knew which routes through town were safest and which attracted attention. All of this made her, in the eyes of one resistance member, potentially perfect for a very dangerous job. The resistance member who first considered using Marie was a woman named Elise, who had been a teacher before the war and now worked for the same textile factory as Marie's mother. Elise was one of the few remaining members of the local network with any connection to the larger Belgian resistance structure. She had been looking for weeks for a way to move a packet of information to a contact in a neighboring town, a journey of about 15 kilometers that crossed through 2 German checkpoints. Every adult they considered seemed to present insurmountable problems. Men of military age were automatically suspicious. Women traveling alone were questioned extensively. Older people moving between towns needed approved reasons for travel. But children were beneath notice. Children were part of the landscape, especially children running errands, making deliveries, visiting relatives. Elise had watched Marie for weeks, had seen how the girl moved through the occupied town with confidence, how soldiers at checkpoints barely glanced at her when she passed through with her younger siblings. And slowly an audacious idea formed. What if they could use that invisibility? What if Marie could carry messages that adult couriers couldn't? But this wasn't a decision to be made lightly. And this is where the story becomes more complex and morally troubling than a simple tale of resistance heroism. Think about what Elise was considering. She was thinking about deliberately placing a child in danger, about using someone too young to fully understand the risks they were taking, about potentially exposing not just Marie, but her entire family to the brutal retaliation that came when the Germans discovered resistance activity. The penalty for carrying intelligence documents wasn't arrest or imprisonment. It was execution, typically carried out publicly as a warning to others. And the Germans had shown repeatedly that they would extend that punishment to family members, especially if they believed the family was complicit. So when Elise first approached Marie's mother with this proposal, it went exactly as you might expect. The mother refused. Absolutely not. She had already lost her husband to this war. She was not going to risk her daughter, risk her entire family for the resistance. The conversation was short, and the answer was final. But then, about a week later, something happened that changed the calculation. Marie's mother was at the factory when a shipment of finished textile goods was being loaded for transport to Germany. The supervisor, a collaborator who had grown wealthy working with the Germans, was boasting to some of the German officers about the efficiency of his operation. He mentioned that they had exceeded production quotas, that they were sending more material to support the German war effort than any other factory in the region. And as Marie's mother listened to this, something snapped inside her. Her husband had died fighting these people. She was being forced to work producing materials that would be used against the Allies, against the cause her husband had died for. And in that moment, the risk of doing something, anything, to resist seemed less terrible than the certainty of collaboration.
That evening, Marie's mother came to Elise with a counterproposal. She would not forbid her daughter from working for the resistance, but she had conditions. First, Marie had to agree voluntarily, had to understand as much of the risk as was appropriate for a 12-year-old to understand. Second, Marie would only carry messages, never weapons or anything that could be construed as offensive materials. Third, Marie would not be told more than was absolutely necessary about the network, about contacts, about operations. If she was caught, she wouldn't be able to betray information she didn't have. And fourth, this would only continue as long as it remained relatively safe, as long as the checkpoints remained routine and the Germans remained relatively relaxed about children's movements. The moment the situation became more dangerous, this arrangement would end. Elise agreed to all of these conditions, though both women knew that promises about safety and occupied territory were essentially meaningless. And then came the harder part, explaining to Marie what they were asking her to do. This conversation happened in the kitchen of Marie's small apartment, late at night after the younger children were asleep. Marie's mother and Elise sat with the girl and, as carefully as they could, explained that there were people working to resist the occupation, to help the Allies, to fight back against the forces that had killed her father. They explained that these people needed to send information to each other, but that the Germans watched adults very carefully and arrested anyone they suspected of resistance activity. And they explained that Marie, because she was young and because soldiers tended not to pay much attention to children, might be able to help by carrying messages. They did not tell her, at least not initially, what kind of information she would be carrying. They did not explain the intelligence value of troop movement reports or fortification details. They did not spell out the specific penalties for espionage. They tried to frame it as helping the resistance in a small way, as doing something to honor her father's memory, as being brave but also being careful. And Marie, who had grown up reading adventure stories about heroes and resistance fighters, who had idealized her father's death in the way that children often do with tragedy, agreed almost immediately. She wanted to help. She wanted to do something that mattered. She wanted, in her 12-year-old understanding, to be brave like the characters in her books. Looking back with adult eyes, it's hard not to see the manipulation in this, hard not to recognize that a child cannot truly give informed consent to espionage work. But it's also important to understand the context. This was total war in occupied territory. Entire families were being destroyed. Children were starving. The normal rules and protections of peacetime society had collapsed. People were making impossible choices in impossible circumstances, and judging them by the standards of comfort and safety is perhaps too easy. Marie's first mission was deliberately simple. She was given a letter sealed in an envelope and told to deliver it to a specific address in a neighborhood about 2 kilometers from her home. The letter contained nothing sensitive, just a message confirming communication lines and establishing Marie as a trusted courier. She was told to act naturally, to walk at a normal pace, to look like any child running an errand for her mother. If stopped by soldiers, she was to say she was delivering a letter from her mother to a friend, which was true enough to pass casual inspection. The envelope was addressed to a real person, a woman named Sophie, who was indeed a friend of Marie's mother, though what the soldiers wouldn't know is that Sophie was also part of the resistance network. Marie made that first delivery on a cold November afternoon. She walked through streets she knew well, past German patrols that barely glanced at her, past checkpoints where soldiers were too busy processing adults to pay attention to a child. She knocked on Sophie's door, handed over the letter, and walked home. The entire operation took less than an hour. And just like that, Marie had become a courier for the Belgian resistance. But she had no idea, none at all, that this simple first mission was just a test, a way to see if she could move through the town without drawing attention. The real work was about to begin, and it would be far more dangerous than anything she had imagined.
Over the next several weeks, Marie made increasingly important deliveries. The messages she carried grew more sensitive, the distances she traveled grew longer, and the security around her operations grew more elaborate. But here's the genius of how the network used her. They never told her what she was carrying. Each time she was given what looked like innocent items. Sometimes it was a letter sealed in an envelope. Sometimes it was a book with messages written in invisible ink between the lines of text. Sometimes it was a doll, the kind of toy a child might carry with microfilm hidden in its hollow interior. Marie was told where to go, who to give the item to, and what to say if questioned. She was taught to observe German military activity as she traveled and to report what she saw, though this was framed as just being observant, not as intelligence gathering. She was instructed to memorize routes through town that avoided the busiest checkpoints. She was drilled on her cover story until it was automatic. But she was never told the content of the messages she carried or the significance of the information she was moving. This was partly for her protection. The less she knew, the less she could reveal if checked. But it was also because the adults running her genuinely believed she would be safer if she appeared genuinely innocent, if her ignorance of what she carried was real rather than feigned. The turning point in Marie's work came in January of 1943, and it involved an intelligence coup that would eventually contribute to a major Allied operation, though again, Marie had no understanding of this at the time. The resistance network had obtained detailed information about German fortifications along the coast, information that included defensive positions, artillery placements, minefield locations, and troop strength estimates. This was exactly the kind of intelligence that Allied planners desperately needed as they began preparing for eventual invasion operations. But the information was on multiple pages of detailed maps and notes, far too much to memorize, too sensitive to send by radio where it might be intersected. It had to be physically moved to a coastal town where a network with access to a clandestine radio transmitter could forward it to London. And the route to that coastal town crossed through 4 German checkpoints, each one more serious than the casual street corner patrols Marie was used to passing.
The preparation for this mission was far more elaborate than anything Marie had experienced before. First, there was the cover story, which had to be bulletproof because there was a real chance Marie would be questioned at length at one or more checkpoints. The story was that she was traveling to visit her mother's sister, who lived in the coastal town and who was ill. This part was actually true. Marie did have an aunt in that town, and the woman had agreed to play her part in this operation. If the Germans decided to verify Marie's story, they would find an aunt who confirmed that yes, her niece was coming to visit. Marie was given a letter from her mother to her aunt, a perfectly innocent letter about family matters, which could be inspected without revealing anything. She was given a small suitcase with a change of clothes and personal items, exactly what a child traveling for a few days would carry. And then, very carefully, very methodically, the intelligence documents were hidden in ways that would escape all but the most thorough search. Some pages were folded into tiny squares and sewn into the lining of her coat. Others were hidden in the false bottom of her suitcase beneath a layer of clothing. A few were rolled into tight tubes and inserted into the hollow handles of her toothbrush and hairbrush. The level of tradecraft involved in preparing a 12-year-old for this mission was remarkable, and it speaks to how desperate the situation had become that this seemed like the best option available. Marie left on a cold morning in late January. Her mother walked her to the train station, playing the part of a concerned parent seeing her daughter off on a journey. The performance had to be real, because informants were everywhere, because any hint of unusual behavior could draw attention. At the station, Marie bought her ticket with money the resistance had provided, climbed onto a train that was crowded with German soldiers and local civilians, and found a seat near a window. The journey should have taken less than 2 hours, but wartime train travel was unpredictable, subject to delays and inspections. Marie sat quietly, looking like any bored child on a tedious journey, while sewn into her coat and hidden in her luggage was information that would eventually help Allied planners understand German coastal defenses and contribute to saving lives during future operations. The first checkpoint came at a town about halfway to her destination. All passengers were required to disembark and pass through an inspection station where German soldiers checked papers and questioned travelers. Marie had been through checkpoints before, but never one this formal, never with this much at stake. She stood in line, clutching her small suitcase, watching as adults ahead of her were questioned and sometimes pulled aside for more thorough inspection. When her turn came, a German soldier who looked barely older than 20 glanced at her papers, which identified her as a Belgian citizen traveling to visit family. He asked where she was going. She told him, her voice steady, exactly what she had been instructed to say. He asked why she was traveling. She explained about her sick aunt, showed him the letter from her mother. He looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment, the entire operation hung in the balance. Then he waved her through. Just like that, the search of her luggage was cursory. The inspection of her person was non-existent. She was a child, and therefore beneath serious suspicion.
But here's what makes this story both inspiring and heartbreaking. Marie was terrified. She maintained her composure, played her part perfectly, but later she would describe that checkpoint inspection as one of the most frightening experiences of her life. She was certain she would be caught. She was convinced the soldier could somehow sense the documents hidden on her person. She was sure that at any moment she would be arrested and her family would be dragged from their home and everything would collapse. But she didn't show it. She smiled politely at the German soldier. She thanked him in German, one of the phrases she had been taught. She picked up her suitcase and walked calmly through the checkpoint and got back on the train. And only when the train started moving again did she allow herself to shake, to feel the terror that she had been suppressing. This is what courage actually looks like, not the absence of fear, but the ability to function despite it. And Marie, at 12 years old, was demonstrating a level of courage that most adults would find difficult to match. The second checkpoint was less formal, just soldiers walking through the train checking papers while it sat at a station. Marie went through the same routine, the same story, the same careful maintenance of innocent appearance. Again, she passed without serious inspection. The third checkpoint was similar. And finally, after a journey that felt endless to Marie but actually took just over 3 hours, she arrived at the coastal town. Her aunt was waiting at the station exactly as planned. They embraced, playing the role of family reunion, and walked together through the town to her aunt's small house. Only when they were safely inside, with doors closed and curtains drawn, did the serious work begin. Marie's aunt, it turned out, was also part of the resistance network, one of the local coordinators who maintained contact with the broader organization. She very carefully helped Marie remove the hidden documents, unsewing the coat lining, opening the false bottom of the suitcase, extracting the papers from their various hiding places. And as she laid out these documents on her kitchen table, as she saw the detail and quality of the intelligence Marie had carried, she understood immediately what the girl had actually accomplished. These documents, this information, was exactly what London had been requesting for months. This could change operational planning. This could save lives. And this 12-year-old girl, who still didn't fully understand what she had carried, had just completed one of the most successful courier operations the Belgian resistance had managed in months. The documents were photographed, encrypted, and transmitted to London within 48 hours. Marie stayed with her aunt for 3 days, which was exactly what her cover story specified, and then made the return journey. The return was actually more dangerous in some ways because the Germans had recently discovered a resistance cell operating near the coastal area and security had been increased. But Marie passed through the heightened checkpoints using the same strategies that had worked before. She was a child returning home from visiting her sick aunt. She had nothing suspicious in her possession. She answered questions politely and briefly, and she was waved through at each checkpoint without serious inspection. Now, you might be wondering what happened with the intelligence Marie delivered. This is where the story becomes both more significant and more frustrating, because the operational security around these events means we don't have complete information about exactly how this intelligence was used. What we know from declassified British military intelligence records is that in early 1943, London received a series of detailed reports about German coastal fortifications in this region of Belgium. We know that this information was incorporated into Allied planning documents that were used when preparing for eventual operations along the Belgian coast. We know that the quality and detail of this intelligence was noted as exceptional in several reports. And we know that resistance networks in Belgium were specifically thanked in post-war assessments for providing intelligence that contributed to operational success and reduced Allied casualties. But we can't draw a direct line from Marie's specific delivery to a specific operation, because that's not how intelligence work operates. Information gets combined, cross-referenced, updated, and integrated into larger assessments. Marie's delivery was one piece of a much larger puzzle, but it was an important piece, and the fact that it got through at all was remarkable. So, if you're still watching, if this story is hitting you the way it hit me when I first discovered it, do me a favor and let me know in the comments what you think about using children in resistance operations. It's a complicated moral question without easy answers, and I genuinely want to know what you think. And while you're down there, hit that like button because it helps this channel reach more people who appreciate these kinds of deep dives into forgotten history.
Marie continued her courier work for several more months, though never again with anything as sensitive as those coastal fortification documents. She made dozens of deliveries around her town and to neighboring communities. She carried messages, small packages, and occasionally funds that the resistance network needed to move. She became, in essence, a regular part of the network's communications infrastructure. But the situation was changing in ways that would eventually end her involvement. By spring of 1943, the Germans were increasingly aware of resistance activity in the region. They had begun to suspect that information was leaking despite their counterintelligence efforts. Security at checkpoints became more stringent. Soldiers who had been casual about checking children began to pay more attention. There were rumors of children being used by resistance networks in other parts of occupied Europe, and German intelligence had circulated warnings about this possibility. The protection that Marie's age had provided was beginning to erode. The resistance network coordinators noticed this change and understood that continuing to use Marie was becoming untenable. But there was another factor that ultimately ended her operational career, and it had to do with Marie herself beginning to understand what she had actually been doing. Remember that Marie had been kept deliberately ignorant of the significance of her deliveries, had been told she was helping in small ways, but had never been given the full picture of what her work meant. But as the months passed, as she overheard conversations and pieced together fragments of information, she began to understand more. She learned that messages she had carried had helped coordinate resistance actions. She understood that intelligence she had moved had gone to London, had been used by the Allies. She realized, with growing horror, that if she had been caught, the consequences would have been far more severe than she had imagined. And this knowledge changed something fundamental in her. The innocent courage that had allowed her to walk through checkpoints without showing fear was replaced by a more adult understanding of danger. And with that understanding came a fear that was harder to hide. She began to have nightmares about being arrested. She became nervous at checkpoints in ways she hadn't been before. The adults running her noticed the change and understood what it meant. Marie had been effective precisely because of her innocent ignorance, and now that ignorance was gone. In May of 1943, after a delivery that Marie completed successfully but with visible anxiety that concerned her handlers, the decision was made to retire her from active operations.
Elise and Marie's mother sat down with the girl and explained that she had done more than enough, that her work had been incredibly valuable, but that it was time for her to go back to being just a child, to focus on her studies and her family and her safety.
Marie's reaction to this conversation reveals a lot about what these months had done to her. She was relieved, absolutely relieved, to be told she didn't have to make any more dangerous deliveries. But she was also, strangely, a little disappointed. She had found purpose in this work, had felt like she was doing something important, had been proud of her courage even as she was terrified by what she was doing. Being told it was over felt like being told she was no longer needed, no longer valuable. This is one of the psychological complexities of using young people in dangerous work. Even when it's necessary, even when it's done with the best intentions, it creates complicated emotional legacies. Marie would spend the rest of her life trying to understand her feelings about what she had done, about whether it had been right or wrong, about whether she had been brave or had simply been too young to understand the risk. But the immediate question in spring of 1943 was what would happen next, both for Marie and for the resistance network that had relied on her. And this is where the story takes another turn, because Marie's work, brief as it was, had created ripples that extended far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The intelligence that Marie and other couriers like her had moved to London didn't just sit in files. It was actively used by Allied planners who were beginning to think seriously about operations in Western Europe. The detailed information about coastal fortifications, troop positions, and defensive structures was exactly what military strategists needed as they contemplated eventual invasion plans. And here's something that even the resistance members who ran Marie didn't fully understand at the time. The intelligence from the Belgian coast that Marie had carried in January 1943 was cross-referenced with information from French resistance networks, with aerial reconnaissance photographs, with signals intelligence from code-breaking operations. All of this was synthesized into detailed assessments of German defensive capabilities along the Atlantic coast. These assessments influenced decisions about where invasions might be feasible, where defenses were strongest, where vulnerabilities existed. They contributed to the enormous planning effort that would eventually result in the D-Day landings in Normandy in June 1944, more than a year after Marie made her dangerous journey to the coast. Now I want to be very careful here to not overstate Marie's individual contribution. The D-Day operation involved intelligence from thousands of sources, years of planning, and the work of countless individuals. Marie was one small part of an enormous intelligence apparatus. But she was a part, and the information she carried did make it into the assessments that planners used. And this means that in some small but real way, Marie's courage, her willingness to walk through German checkpoints with intelligence documents sewn into her coat, contributed to the success of operations that helped liberate Europe. But here's the truly remarkable thing. Marie didn't know any of this. After she was retired from courier work in May 1943, she went back to school, to helping her mother with her younger siblings, to trying to live as normal a life as possible in occupied territory. She had no idea that the documents she had carried were being used by Allied planners. She had no idea that her work had been anything more than helping local resistance efforts in small ways. She certainly had no idea that historians would eventually be studying her contribution to intelligence operations. From her perspective, she had done a few scary things for a few months, and then it had ended, and life had gone on. The Belgian town where Marie lived was liberated by British forces in September 1944. The Germans retreated, the occupation ended, and the town began the long process of recovery and reconstruction. Marie's family survived the war, though they had lost everything. Their apartment had been damaged in the fighting. Marie's mother had lost her job when the textile factory closed. They had very little food and even less money. But they were alive, which was more than could be said for many families in the region. In the immediate post-war period, there was a push to recognize resistance members, to honor those who had fought against the occupation. Some people received medals, some received official recognition, some had their stories told in local newspapers. But Marie wasn't among them, at least not initially. Part of this was because she had been so young.
and there was uncertainty about how to recognize child resistance workers. Part of it was because her role had been as a courier, support work, rather than the armed resistance that was easier to recognize and celebrate. And part of it was because the full significance of the intelligence she had carried remained classified for years after the war ended.
It wasn't until the 1960s, when some wartime intelligence files began to be declassified, that researchers started to understand the full scope of the courier networks that had operated in occupied Europe and the role that young people had played in those networks. Marie was in her 30s by then, married with children of her own, working as a clerk in a local government office. She had rarely talked about her wartime activities, partly because she didn't think they were particularly significant, and partly because the memories were still painful. But a historian researching Belgian resistance networks tracked her down, interviewed her extensively, and began to piece together the story of what she had actually accomplished. This historian found references in British military intelligence files to intelligence reports from the Belgian coast in early 1943, traced those reports back to the resistance network in Marie's region, and eventually connected them to the courier operation that Marie had been part of. And slowly, very slowly, Marie began to understand the significance of what she had done. She learned that the documents she had carried to the coast had made it to London. She learned that they had been incorporated into operational planning. She learned that intelligence from resistance networks had contributed to the success of Allied operations that had helped end the war. She learned that her work, her courage, her willingness to walk through those checkpoints despite her terror had mattered in ways she had never imagined. Now, I need to talk about something that's been implicit throughout this story, but needs to be said explicitly. Using children in espionage operations, even in resistance contexts, is deeply problematic. It violates their right to childhood, exposes them to trauma they're not equipped to process, and places them in danger they can't fully consent to. Marie herself, in interviews conducted later in her life, expressed profound ambivalence about what had happened to her. She was proud of what she had done, proud that she had contributed to the fight against occupation, proud that she had honored her father's memory. But she was also angry that she had been put in that position, that adults had made decisions that exposed her to such danger, that her childhood had been stolen by circumstances beyond her control. She described experiencing what we would now recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress, nightmares and anxiety that lasted for years after the war ended. She talked about the difficulty of reconciling her pride in her courage with her anger at having been used. This is important context that we can't ignore. The story of Marie's bravery is also a story about the moral costs of total war, about the impossible choices people make in impossible circumstances, about the ways that violence and conflict consume everything they touch, even childhood innocence. It's not enough to celebrate Marie's courage without also acknowledging the tragedy of her having needed to be courageous in the first place.
But let me tell you about one more aspect of this story, something that brings us back to the title I gave this video. Remember how I said that Marie changed the war without knowing it? Here's what I mean by that. The intelligence that Marie carried to the coast in January 1943 was detailed information about German fortifications. That information made it into Allied planning documents. Those planning documents influenced decisions about how to approach operations along the Belgian coast. And one of the things that intelligence revealed was that the Germans had concentrated particularly heavy fortifications in certain areas, while leaving other areas relatively less defended. This information contributed to decisions about where to focus deception operations designed to make the Germans think invasions might come. It influenced where limited Allied resources should be deployed to maximize impact. It helped planners understand which defensive positions would need to be suppressed with naval bombardment and which could potentially be bypassed. And all of these small contributions added up.
When British and Canadian forces landed on Belgian beaches in September 1944 as part of the broader campaign to liberate the Low Countries, they encountered German defenses that, while still formidable, were perhaps slightly less prepared in certain locations because of intelligence-guided operational planning. It's impossible to quantify exactly how many lives were saved or how much the war was shortened by any single piece of intelligence. But we know that good intelligence saves lives. We know that understanding enemy defenses allows for better planning. We know that the work of resistance networks and the intelligence they provided made a difference. And we know that Marie was part of that work, part of that effort, part of that contribution. Marie lived until 2003, passing away at the age of 73. In the last decades of her life, she gave several interviews to historians and occasionally spoke to school groups about her wartime experiences. She was always careful in these presentations to emphasize both the necessity of resistance against occupation and the tragedy of children being involved in war. She wanted young people to understand that courage was important, that standing up against injustice was important, but that the best form of courage was working to prevent wars in the first place so that no other children would have to make the choices she had made. In 1998, she was finally officially recognized by the Belgian government for her resistance work. She received a medal in a small ceremony attended by her family and a few surviving members of the resistance network she had worked with. The citation noted her courage and her contribution to Allied intelligence efforts, though for security reasons even then, it didn't specify exactly what information she had carried or how it had been used. When asked how she felt about the recognition, Marie said something that I think perfectly captures the complexity of her story. She said she was honored, but that she wished the medal wasn't necessary, wished the war hadn't happened, wished she could have just been a child doing child things instead of a spy doing things no child should have to do. She said she hoped people would remember her story not as a celebration of child soldiers, but as a reminder of the terrible costs of war and the importance of peace. So what are we to make of Marie's story? What lessons should we take from this tale of a 12-year-old girl who carried intelligence through enemy checkpoints and contributed, in ways she didn't understand, to the Allied victory in World War II? I think there are several. First, heroism is often found in unexpected places. We tend to think of war heroes as soldiers in uniform, as people who fit our preconceived notions of what bravery looks like. But courage can come from anywhere, from anyone, including a 12-year-old girl just trying to honor her father's memory and help her country. Second, intelligence work, the unglamorous, dangerous, often invisible work of gathering and moving information, is absolutely critical to military success. The spies, the couriers, the resistance members who risked everything to provide information to the Allies made a difference that we're still recognizing and understanding decades later. Third, war is not clean or simple or easily categorized into good and evil. Marie's story is inspiring, but it's also troubling. It raises questions about what we ask of children in times of crisis, about the moral costs of resistance, about the ways that violence perpetuates itself even in the cause of fighting against occupation. And fourth, history is full of stories like Marie's, stories that didn't make it into the history books, stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in circumstances they never asked for. This channel exists to tell those stories, to find the human details in the grand sweep of historical events, to remind us that history is made by individuals whose names we often never learn.
Before we wrap up, I want to talk about what happened to the other people in the story. Marie's mother survived the war and lived until the 1970s. She never spoke publicly about her daughter's resistance work, maintaining the same protective secrecy even after the war ended. Elise, the teacher who first recruited Marie, was arrested by the Germans in late 1943 for resistance activities unrelated to Marie's work. She survived imprisonment and returned to teaching after the war, though she carried physical and psychological scars from her captivity for the rest of her life. The resistance network that Marie worked with
was largely destroyed by German counterintelligence operations in 1944, just months before liberation. Many of its members were arrested, and several were executed. The network's work, including the intelligence that Marie and others had helped move, continued to be used by Allied planners even after the network itself no longer existed. Marie's aunt, who received the intelligence documents at the coastal town, continued resistance work throughout the war and was eventually recognized as a significant figure in the Belgian underground. She and Marie remained close throughout their lives, bound by shared experiences they could never fully explain to anyone who hadn't lived through them. The intelligence from the Belgian coast that Marie carried was eventually incorporated into after-action reports and historical analyses of Allied planning for Western European operations. Researchers studying these documents decades later noted the quality and detail of the intelligence, but had no idea that it had been carried through German checkpoints by a 12-year-old girl. And this brings me to the final, perhaps most important point about Marie's story. For most of her life, Marie thought what she had done was relatively insignificant. She knew she had been brave, knew she had helped the resistance, but she thought her contribution had been minor, just a small part of a much larger effort. And in one sense, she was right. The war was won through the efforts of millions of people, through countless individual acts of courage and sacrifice, through industrial production and military strategy and diplomatic maneuvering. Marie was one person among millions. But here's what makes history fascinating and humbling. You never know which small actions will have large consequences, which individual choices will create ripples that spread far beyond their immediate context, which moments of courage will turn out to have been more significant than anyone realized at the time. Marie carried documents through German checkpoints. Those documents contributed to intelligence assessments. Those assessments influenced operational planning. That planning contributed to military operations. Those operations helped liberate Europe. And at no point did Marie know that this chain of consequences existed. She just knew that someone needed to deliver a package, that she was in a position to help, and that despite her fear, she was going to do it. That's what courage actually is. Not the absence of fear, not the certainty of success, not the knowledge that what you're doing is historically significant. Just the decision to do what needs to be done, despite not knowing how it will turn out.
If you've made it this far, thank you for staying with me through this long, complex, and I hope meaningful exploration of one young person's wartime experience. This is exactly the kind of story I love to research and share, the stories that don't fit neatly into conventional narratives, that raise uncomfortable questions, that remind us of the human complexity behind historical events. If you appreciate this kind of content, please subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell so you don't miss future videos. We've got more incredible stories like this one coming, stories of forgotten heroes, unexpected victories, and the countless individuals whose courage shaped history in ways they never knew. And please, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what you think about Marie's story. Tell me whether you think the Resistance Network was right to use a child courier. Tell me what lessons you take from this tale of courage and innocence and the terrible costs of war. I read every comment, and your perspectives make this community what it is. Also, give this video a like if you found it valuable. It genuinely helps more people discover these forgotten stories, and that's what this channel is all about. Marie's story deserves to be told, deserves to be remembered, deserves to be wrestled with in all its complexity. And the only way that happens is if people like you help spread these stories to others who might appreciate them. Let me leave you with one final thought from Marie herself, something she said in one of her last interviews before she passed away. She was asked what she would want people to remember about her wartime experiences, and her answer was characteristically thoughtful and nuanced. She said she hoped people would remember that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary courage when circumstances demanded, but that we should work to create a world where such courage isn't necessary, where children can be children and wars are prevented before they start. She said she was proud of what she had done but wished she hadn't had to do it. She said she believed in standing up against injustice, but hoped future generations would find ways to resist that didn't require putting children in danger. And she said that if her story inspired anyone, she hoped it would inspire them not to seek out danger or adventure, but to appreciate peace, to protect the vulnerable, and to remember that every person caught up in historical events is a human being with fears and hopes and a life that extends beyond that one moment of courage. I think that's a pretty good lesson to take from all of this. Marie was a 12-year-old spy who changed the war without knowing it, who carried intelligence that contributed to Allied victory, who demonstrated courage beyond her years. But she was also a girl who lost her father, who was terrified at checkpoints, who had nightmares about being arrested, who struggled for years to understand what had happened to her. Both things are true. Both things matter. And holding both of those truths simultaneously is what allows us to really understand history and all its messy, complicated human reality. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about these stories. Thank you for being part of a community that values deep historical exploration over superficial narratives. I'll see you in the next video, where we'll explore another forgotten story from World War II, another tale of courage and complexity that deserves to be remembered. Until then, take care of yourselves, appreciate the peace that Marie fought for, and never forget that history is made by individuals whose names we often never learn. Like Marie, who for most of her life was just one person among millions, but whose courage mattered more than anyone knew at the time. That's the lesson. That's what we take from this. And that's why these stories matter.